Hey, I'm Sooper. Welcome back. During my senior year of high school, I rented a movie from the local Blockbuster called Army of Darkness. And just because it looked like some goofy, fun action fantasy adventure for a Friday night. It was completely absurd. It was not like any movie that I'd ever seen before. I had no idea at the time that it was the third part of a series. After that, I definitely rented Army of Darkness several more times, and I kept looking for the other two films once I found out about them, but it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years later, when they were finally released on DVD, that I was able to get hold of the first two Evil Dead movies. So because the last two films series that I discussed on this channel directly referenced it in some way, I thought that I would do a video review of the Evil Dead series. Evil Dead started out as a short film called Within the Woods, directed by Sam Raimi and starring Bruce Campbell. Raimi and his friends had been making short 8mm films for a good while before that, but it was mostly comedy stuff, until they did a horror-esque scene in another short film that he had done called It's Murder, and started looking into the genre more and got really hooked on it. Eventually, Raimi adapted a motto for his horror sensibility, "The gore the merrier," which definitely showed where his career was going to go for a good while. So he made Within the Woods as a sort of prototype of the full-length movie that he wanted to make if he could get some funding. Once he got that, mostly from borrowing from friends, Evil Dead was put out in 1982. One thing that does kind of stand out in the first movie and then continues through the rest of the series is that Ash, the main character in 3 of these movies and a TV series for 3 seasons, is the kind of character that would die very early on if this were a slasher movie. But Evil Dead isn't quite a slasher genre film. It more falls into the splatter genre, which was initially something coined by George Romero during the filming of Dawn of the Dead from a few years before this. Splatter films tend to be like, as you would expect from the name, more focused on the gore and outrageous effects. Where the prototypical slasher film, Halloween, barely has any blood at all, and everything, most of the violence is very suggested, but not shown. Splatter flicks are positively slipping in it as it pools all over the floor in a wet slick. The basic plot of The Evil Dead is that 5 college-age friends drive from Michigan to Tennessee to stay at a remote cabin in the woods. Once they get there, they find a cellar with a strange, creepy-looking book and a tape recorder. When they start playing the tape, they discover that the book is a version of the Book of the Dead, most frequently referred to in the series as the Necronomicon, bound in human flesh and written in human blood. When the recording then starts reciting passages from the book, something evil is unleashed in the woods that starts corrupting everyone. Over the course of the movie, the characters slowly get possessed and start attacking the others. Eventually, Ash Williams, played by Bruce Campbell in here as well as Within the Woods, is the only one left alive after he's able to burn the book and escape the cabin. Then something creeps up on him and attacks. End of movie. This first movie, Evil Dead, is an interesting example of how to create something creepy and incredibly gross with no real budget. Effects in this were done with whatever they had on hand or could come up with, including stuff like strapping a camera onto a motorcycle or a wooden board for moving shots because they couldn't afford a dolly, Steadicam equipment, any of that. And because of those DIY methods, it gives the films in this series a look and feel that's completely unique. So many great innovations in cinema occur because they've got to find a way to do something that they don't have the budget or equipment to do in the normal way, or that there is no way that exists to do something, so they've got to come up with it on the fly. One thing negative here, in Evil Dead, there is a sequence in which a woman is attacked by a demonic tree and sexually assaulted by it. It's more suggested than overtly graphic, but it is the kind of thing that some might find upsetting. And in fact, if you don't find it upsetting, I'm actually concerned about you, because it's very upsetting. I really could do without this particular bit in the movie. They have a revised version of it that they do in Evil Dead 2, but there's no suggestion of a sexual component, and the scene and the scare within it work perfectly fine. So it really doesn't need this. Could have been cut. should have been cut. Evil Dead was rated X by the MPAA just due to the violence and was outright banned in some countries, considered part of the list of so-called video nasties in the UK, and not widely available for a long time on any kind of home video format. Evil Dead's played fairly straight. There's humor there. It's right under the surface, but it doesn't feel like the humor is intentional. Raimi has said that he was very definitely not trying to be funny when he was making this first movie. The tone throughout it is intended to be scary and disturbing, and there's this foreboding sort of doom going on under it. And it's very gross and grimy, kind of like a lot of late 70s, early 80s splatter films are. Evil Dead made a profit, but it didn't light up Sam Raimi's career the way that he'd hoped. It took another 5 years before he was able to get Evil Dead 2 made, partially due to the influence of Stephen King. King had really loved the original film and he'd been a vocal advocate for it. He ended up getting a producer, Dino De Laurentiis, on board, and Evil Dead 2 went into production for a 1987 release. This sequel, which is subtitled Dead by Dawn, was initially conceived by Sam Raimi as a story that would take Ash into the distant past to fight in the Middle Ages. The producers wanted something more like the first movie, though, so what they ended up doing was a slight retelling of the first movie for the first half, with bits put into a blender and reassembled in a different order, and then an actual sequel for the second half of the movie with an ending that leads right into the Middle Ages movie Raimi had wanted to make in the first place, but wasn't sure he'd ever have the chance to do. So the plot of this is a lot of the same for most of it. Ash and his girlfriend Linda go to a cabin in the woods, but in this they aren't with their other friends or with Ash's sister. The cabin's just vacant, but it's also kind of not someplace they're supposed to be. Like, they don't have permission to be there. It's not their cabin. But Ash finds this tape recorder in there and decides to start playing this tape, which releases the evil. Then he ends up having to decapitate Linda after she goes evil. And that's like the first 5 minutes of the movie. This is all very similar to a very condensed version of the first movie. He gets attacked by the evil, like at the end of the first movie, but then he ends up back at the cabin, but he's alone now, but he's also possibly not in control of himself completely. Then 4 new people show up, with one of them being the daughter of the doctor who had found the Necronomicon in the first place and done this recording on the tape player that Ash had found. The rest of the movie is them fighting off the Deadites, which is the general term for the creatures that are possessed by the evil entity, while they're trying to find a way to actually end this situation. Evil Dead 2 tends to be even more violent, but in a mostly absurdist bent. So it plays a lot differently than the first movie. There's a lot more physical comedy involving Bruce Campbell fighting with severed heads, headless bodies, eventually his own severed hand that he ends up having to chop off with a chainsaw when it gets possessed, while he gets increasingly splattered with goo in a variety of colors. Due to the intentionally comedic nature of this film, it's considered part of the splatter subgenre known as splatstick, which is apt. One of what I think is the better effective choices that they've made in this series as a whole, in the various POV shots of the evil entities lurking, stalking, and chasing people, is that we almost never see them from an objective point of view. We see people seeing them and running from them, but we don't see that. And it leaves a lot to the imagination, which I do love. The one time that we do see the entity in the flesh near the end of this movie, it's a little goofy, and I don't like it as much, but I understand why they needed a brief physical representation of the evil. Evil Dead starts with Ash being a bit of a doofus and sometimes coward, and by the end he's been transformed into an unlikely shotgun-toting action hero with a chainsaw for a hand, who is also still a bit of a doofus and sometimes coward. And that's kind of how he stays throughout all of his other appearances in media. A lot of the alternate colored blood and goo in the movie was an attempt to deliver an R rating for the film, thinking if the demons bled green or black or something, the MPAA might be less harsh. But then they didn't end up even submitting the film to the MPAA for rating anyway and released it unrated. But I kind of like the multiple colors of blood, so I think it worked out fine. So the movie ends with Ash being sucked into a vortex into the past, winding up in the Middle Ages, where he now realizes he's the one who must fight and end the Deadites once and for all in the distant past. After this movie, Sam Raimi obviously wanted to get a third where he'd be able to continue where he left off, but it didn't happen for another 5 years or so. In the meantime, he made another film called Darkman, which did pretty well and gave him a little bit more of a name to use in pushing for his next installment. So Raimi did get to make the movie he'd planned with Evil Dead 2, except he wanted to call this one Medieval Dead. Personally, I think that title is great. I love it, but the studio decided that they preferred to call it Army of Darkness, which is still a good title, but I think Medieval Dead is better. Sometimes Medieval Dead is better. Sorry. As I said at the top of the video, I loved it, even not knowing any source material or background. There's a slight prologue in the opening of Army of Darkness. It shows him in the Middle Ages, then goes to a voiceover and flashback of how exactly he got here. And even though it is like super condensed and only like, you know, a minute or two of stuff to tell us how exactly he got here and all of this stuff and why he doesn't have a hand, it works. It works well. Like, you have a jumping on point there. You're not sitting there going, well, I'm so confused. There are, in the flashback, they show his girlfriend Linda again. There are 3 movies in this continuity and 3 women who play Ash's now dead girlfriend Linda. In this movie, it's Bridget Fonda. And it's a very brief cameo, but apparently Bridget Fonda was a big fan of Evil Dead 2 and asked if she could have some kind of role in this. She later worked with Raimi on another movie called A Simple Plan with Bill Paxton, and I think that is a very underappreciated movie, and I absolutely love it, but that's a whole other thing. As with Evil Dead 1 and 2, there are differences in the turn of events between 2 and Army of Darkness, but it does still work even if the continuity is a little shaky. This has some elements of the horror comedy splat stick sort of stuff, but it mostly makes me want to go to a Renaissance fair, to be honest. It's much more of a fantasy action-adventure movie than a horror, but it works. I think Bruce Campbell has a gift for pulling off the physical comedy in a way that some other actors tend to overplay and overact with. He does it in a way that's ridiculous. It's very ridiculous. But it also kind of feels natural, like he's a regular guy who is in this ridiculous situation and very annoyed by it, and not a comedian desperately trying to get a laugh. And for me, it works a lot better this way than when I see somebody who is just clearly practically screaming at the audience, "Please, someone laugh at me." A lot of this movie is Ash fighting an evil Deadite version of himself, with them both trying to get a hold of this version of the Necronomicon from this time for their own purposes. Ash eventually destroys Deadite Ash and is able to get back home to the present. There are 2 versions of this ending of this movie. In the original, Ash is given a potion that'll make him sleep until he's back in his own time. But he must take exactly 6 drops of it for it to time out right to give him back to his time. Ash being Ash, he gets distracted and miscounts the drops and takes 7 instead of 6, wakes up and realizes he's now in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I think I said apocalyptic wrong there, but I don't really feel like refilming that entire sentence. Whatever. Universal, who was putting this movie out, said it was too depressing an ending. So Raimi and Campbell and the crew went back. They shot a new ending for it out of their own pockets, which is the one that most people have seen because it was the theatrical version and the version on most video versions of it, in which Ash is back in his own time, but he said the magic words that he was told to say when he used the potion incorrectly. So now occasionally a Deadite still shows up and tries to kill him, but he's now seasoned enough to handle it and get rid of them. It still works, but part of me does kind of love the original ending, but I do tend to love a lot of non-happy endings in films. There have been a variety of comic books with Ash. One of the most notable was after there was a proposed sequel/crossover film with Ash fighting Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees after Freddy vs. Jason, and then that fell through, so they took the story and made that into a comic book instead. But an actual film continuing this franchise didn't happen for another 20 years after Army of Darkness, and that was 2013's soft reboot that's just called Evil Dead. And I don't know why they keep doing these things that are kind of soft reboots slash sequels and just giving them the same name as the original film, like with Halloween and Scream. I don't know why they're doing that. It's very confusing. There's a drastic tone shift in this from the other movies. But honestly, if you think about it, that's nothing new because every film in this series has been a tone shift from the previous installment. One was a played straight splatter flick. 2 is a slapstick, over-the-top horror comedy. 3 was a full-on action-adventure fantasy film, and this one is like a deadly serious modern horror. It keeps a lot of the structure of the original, but remixed a little and with completely different characters. This group of friends is at the cabin to try to help one of the 5 people there, Mia, through drug withdrawals while she's trying to kick, I guess, heroin. I don't remember offhand for sure. I'd have to go back and rewatch it, and I'm in the middle of making this video, so I'm not going to do that. I do think that them trying to help her through withdrawal would be better dealt with in a clinical setting, but our healthcare system is a nightmare, so they're at a dirty cabin in the woods with a trained nurse who's part of the friend group. Also, there is a dog. It gets killed with a hammer by one of the evil deadites. That good boy did not deserve that. This shit is why I get anxious whenever I see a dog in a movie now. I just want the dogs to be okay. I think there's actually even a website that's called Is the Dog Okay or Does the Dog Live or something like that, that just tells you before a movie happens whether any dogs or cats or anything get hurt. Useful. I do think that the drug addiction angle adds an interesting wrinkle in this movie because Mia is the first one that gets affected by the evil. And as her behavior starts to get weird, and it's because she's possessed, and when she's able to be lucid for a moment, she's trying to tell everyone there is something deeply wrong. But they don't believe her about what exactly is wrong because they think that it's just drug withdrawal. They recreate the tree rape scene from the first movie, and I wouldn't have. I don't think that it needed it. I don't think that it was necessary at all, but they sure did do that. As seems to happen in a ton of TV shows and movies, and it always bothers me every time. There's a character in this who gets shot, and he has a superficial wound. It's like a buckshot from a shotgun. He just gets a few little bits of it under his skin, and they decide that they need to remove the bullets from his arm or the shrapnel from his arm with some tweezers. So I just want to say this isn't a case in a lot of cases. It's a case in pretty much any movie you ever see, but digging around in the wound with a pair of tweezers is more likely to cause further injury or infection, especially at a filthy remote cabin in the woods. It's been theorized that digging into the wound and removing the bullet is what actually ended up killing President McKinley, and he may have survived if they hadn't done that. This has been a moment in presidential history with Sooper. One of the characters has her hand get possessed, much like Ash's hand in Dead by Dawn, but where he uses a chainsaw to cut it off, she uses a cheap electric carving knife. Those can't really cut through all that bone like that. It really took me out of the movie as I was just sitting there going, that doesn't work. They also use a nail gun in this to shoot at people, and that's not how nail guns work. I know that it has the word gun in it, but it's not a fucking gun. I know some of these are small details, but it just feels like the kind of thing that a filmmaker does when they don't know how things work and nobody bothers to correct them. And I am a details guy on things like this where, unless there's a specific reason in the narrative why it would work differently, it just bugs me. Eventually, Mia is able to get free of the evil presence in her body with the help of her brother. She's missing part of her arm, all her friends are dead, and she walks off into the woods trying to find a way out, and the movie ends. The director has said that the various specific similarities to the other films that happen within this movie are things the evil entity likes repeating on purpose, and that this is a continuation and not a reboot. I honestly think that that's kind of a cop-out, and there's nothing in the actual film narrative to suggest any such thing. So I recognize that that is what the director says he intended, but he did a bad job of putting that forward. Then there is an after-credits scene, and I say scene, but it's literally 5 seconds of Bruce Campbell's face appearing mostly in shadow and saying groovy. So it's not really a scene. It doesn't give us anything new. It's not got any sort of narrative value. It's just like them apologizing for doing a remake instead of doing anything to link this to the established films. It's an okay film on its own, but I don't enjoy it as much as the rest of the series. The fun in it is kind of lacking there. And I do appreciate that they had Mia end up being the final girl, as they call it, because up until the last 20 minutes of the movie or so, I really thought that her brother was going to be the one who survived, and they were going to essentially make in this movie continuity's version of Ash. So they did surprise me a little there, because I thought that she was like gone and absolutely not going to survive the encounter. A few years later, Ash reappeared in his own TV series called Ash vs. Evil Dead, in which Ash accidentally releases the evil from the Necronomicon again because he's a drunken buffoon. I may do a full review of the series at some point, but in short, the series is about him trying to fix his mistakes, which is a tall order because Ash Williams is a mistake factory. The tone of this series is closest to Evil Dead 2, with a ton of actual horror but a heavy dose of comedy, and the audience watching Ash make the worst possible choices. They're currently working on a sequel to that soft reboot called Evil Dead Rise. Initially, it was supposed to be a sequel to the reboot, as well as a sequel to the earlier series with Bruce Campbell returning, but he's since stated he's officially retired from the role of Ash for good after the TV series ended a few years back. This new movie is supposed to be coming out next year, and I believe is done filming already. Apparently it's going away from the cabin in the woods premise and having someone find the Necronomicon in a shitty apartment building in LA. Only time will tell if that works or not. To me, though, it's weird because it sounds like it is a copy of the British sci-fi film Attack the Block, but with demons instead of aliens. I'm not sure how well that's going to work for me. Overall, I really enjoy the whole series, with Evil Dead 2 being my personal favorite, followed by Army of Darkness. There's a real sense of embracing the ridiculousness in those two, and they're just a lot of fun if you can handle the over-the-top gore that comes up, because a lot of it comes up. The effects work throughout this series is pretty great. In the first three movies, they have some stop motion that they use that's very reminiscent of old Ray Harryhausen flicks, especially in Army of Darkness, with a lot of the skeletons that are fighting that are possessed deadites. Starting with Evil Dead 2, they had Greg Nicotero working on a lot of makeup effects, and he'd also been part of Day of the Dead a few years before that, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, and is more currently known for being heavily involved in both the Walking Dead TV series as well as the revival of Creepshow that's currently on the Shudder service. Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness also feature his partners in the company that would become KNB Effects Group, Howard Berger and Robert Kurtzman. That company has since gone on to work on various movies ranging from Tarantino's Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill to the first Chronicles of Narnia movie, which they got an Oscar nomination for. I'm rambling here, but the effects in this series are distinctive, and I love that. The Deadites and Other Hands could have been just another retread of like Romero zombies, which would have been easy since the effects guys in these worked on those movies. But instead, the Deadites are their own thing with their own flavor, and it's unlike anything else in any other horror series that I've seen. And it's all done practical with real physical objects mostly. Even the most recent Evil Dead from 2013 did as much of their effects practically as they possibly could. CGI has its place, but it can't replace a real on-set effect in most cases. As I got into with the effects team, Sam Raimi has gone on to become a real name in directing, having gone on to make 2 pretty good Spider-Man movies. I know he made a third, but I don't like it. His next film that he's directing is Marvel's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which is touted as the first horror movie within the MCU, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that come out next year. So thanks for coming to my meltdown. This video's over. I will be back soon with another horror-related video because of who I am as a person. I hope you'll come back and see it. I hope you liked this. If you did, you can like and subscribe, you know, all of the regular stuff, blah, blah, comments, etc. I'm gonna go away now and go edit this.